You have eaten white bread. You have eaten sourdough. You have eaten dinner rolls from a plastic bag that cost $2. But you have never eaten Manchet. Manchet was the finest bread ever baked in medieval England. Not because bakers had better machines, not because they had better kitchens, because they had a process that took 3 days, required hand-sifting flour through silk, and produced a loaf so light it almost floated. It weighed about 6 ounces. It fit in the palm of your hand. And if you were not a king, a lord, or a bishop, you would never taste one in your entire life. Here is what most people get wrong about medieval bread. They picture dark, hard, gritty slabs that peasants gnawed in the dark. Some bread was like that. But at the very top of the table, the king's table, the bishop's palace, the great hall, bakers were producing something the modern world has completely forgotten how to make. In 1588, a book called The Good Huswife's Jewel by Thomas Dawson described the Manchet recipe in detail. Dawson wrote that the dough needed to be worked for 30 minutes by hand, shaped into small round loaves, and baked slowly until the crust was gold, and the inside was as fine and white as snow. Today, almost no one has heard of Manchet. No bakery sells it. No supermarket stocks it. The recipe exists in old books that almost nobody reads. This is the story of what Manchet was, who baked it, who ate it, why it worked, and why it disappeared. Not because a better bread replaced it, but because the world that needed it and the bakers who made it simply stopped existing. What Manchet actually was. Walk into a Tudor bakehouse in 1550. The head baker is already awake at 4 in the morning. He starts with flour, but not just any flour. He takes wheat flour and runs it through a fine cloth sieve, sometimes silk, sometimes fine linen, over and over until every piece of bran and germ is gone. What he ends up with is powder, pure, white, almost weightless. This process had a name. It was called bolting. The finer the bolt, the whiter the flour. The whiter the flour, the higher the status of the bread. Here is what nobody tells you about medieval flour. Bolted fine flour was not the standard, it was the exception. Most flour in medieval England kept the bran in. Coarse bread, called maslin, ravel, or cheat, was what ordinary people ate. Fine bolted flour cost roughly 4 times as much per bushel as standard wheat flour in 1540s England, according to household accounts from Hampton Court Palace. 4 times the cost, before the baker had even done anything else. Once the flour was ready, the baker added ale balm, the thick living yeast foam scraped off fermenting beer barrels, then salt, then warm milk or water. He worked the dough for 30 minutes to build the structure. The dough rested. Then the baker weighed each piece between 5 and 7 ounces. He shaped them into small rounds, slightly flattened on top. With a knife, he scored a ring around the edge of each loaf. This ring was not decoration. It helped the bread expand evenly in the oven. It kept the top from cracking at random and tearing the crust. The loaves went into a wood-fired brick oven at around 400 degrees Fahrenheit. They baked for roughly 30 to 45 minutes. What came out was a small round loaf, pale gold on the outside, white as chalk on the inside, soft, light. The crust was thin and crackled when you pressed it. The crumb was so fine-textured it looked almost uniform. No big air bubbles, no dense spots. Just clean, white, even bread. The Encyclopedia of Domestic Economy of 1844, one of the last texts to describe Manchet from memory, called it the softest and most delicate bread ever made in England. That is Manchet. A 6-ounce loaf of white bread so refined it took twice the flour, 4 times the labour, and only the best wheat to produce. small enough to fit in a pocket, expensive enough that most people in England never touched one. Who ate it and who didn't? Here is what most people get wrong about who ate Manchet. It was not for the hungry, it was for the powerful. Medieval England had a bread hierarchy. It was not informal. It was written into law, into household accounts, and into the social fabric of daily life. The assize of bread and ale, first passed in 1266 and enforced for nearly 600 years, set standards for different grades of bread. At the top was Manchet, called Manchet, or pain de main. At the bottom was horse bread, made from beans and whatever grain was left over. There were 6 grades in between. What you ate told everyone in the room exactly who you were. The people who ate Manchet had a name. In Tudor household accounts, they were listed as those at the high table. They were lords, senior clergy, wealthy merchants, and, always, the head of the household. At Hampton Court, household accounts from 1526 show that King Henry VIII's table received Manchet daily. His servants received coarser grades depending on their rank. The lowest ranking kitchen workers received bread made from rye and bran. The people who baked Manchet were a different class entirely. They were professional bakers employed in large households. The head baker at a wealthy manor was a skilled and respected position. Household records from Ingatestone Hall in Essex, dated 1552, show that the head baker was paid more than most other domestic servants. He had assistants. He had dedicated equipment. He kept detailed records of flour weight, loaf count, and bran yield. Here is what nobody tells you about the Manchet baker. He was not free to sell his bread. He baked only for the household. His loaves were counted, weighed, and recorded. If a loaf came out underweight, it was noted. If too many loaves failed, the baker answered for it. The Ingatestone Hall accounts show bread inspections happening weekly. This was a controlled, documented, highly skilled operation that served maybe a dozen people at the top of the social ladder. Everyone else ate something else. The average English labourer in 1550 ate roughly 2 pounds of coarse bread per day. It gave him most of his calories. He ate it with pottage, with onions, with occasional salt fish. He ate it because it kept him alive. He never ate Manchet. That gap between the bread that kept you alive and the bread that announced your status is the whole story of Manchet. One was fuel. The other was a statement of power delivered 3 times a day at every meal. Why it actually worked. Manchet was not just expensive because of its ingredients. It was expensive because the process that made it worked. Here is the science, and it is simple. Fine bolted white flour has almost no bran. Bran contains sharp, jagged particles. These particles cut through gluten strands as the dough develops. More bran means weaker gluten. Weaker gluten means less rise. Less rise means denser bread. Remove the bran completely. Now your gluten builds without interruption. The dough becomes elastic and strong. It traps gas bubbles evenly. The bread rises more. The crumb is finer. Think of it like this. Imagine building a net out of thread. Now imagine someone randomly cutting sections of that net as you build. That is what bran does to gluten. Bolted flour removes the scissors. The ale balm added another layer of precision. Ale balm was not dry packaged yeast. It was a living community of yeast cells and bacteria, freshly taken from active fermentation. When you added it to Manchet dough, it produced gas slowly and steadily. The rise was controlled. Not too fast, not too slow. A 2019 study from the University of Copenhagen's Department of Food Science analysed the leavening properties of historical ale balm cultures recreated from period recipes. they found that barm fermentation produced a more even bubble structure than modern commercial yeast, meaning finer crumb texture, because the mixed microbial culture released gas more gradually over the full rise period. The Manchet baker did not know this. He knew that bread made with fresh good barm rose better and tasted better than bread made with old or weak barm. He knew it from doing it every day for years. The 30 minutes of hand kneading was the third factor. 30 minutes of working dough develops gluten fully. Modern bakers using high gluten flour and stand mixers often knead for 8 to 12 minutes. Hand kneading for 30 minutes achieves something different. It aligns gluten strands more uniformly, creating a tighter, smoother crumb structure. Dr. Stephen Kaplan, a food historian at Cornell University who has spent decades studying European bread history, wrote in his 2006 book, Good Bread is Back, that the fine white breads of pre-industrial Europe represented a convergence of technique that modern industrial baking has never been able to fully replicate, not because the methods were secret, but because they require time and labor that industrial systems cannot afford. Here is what makes this remarkable. The Manchet baker was not trying to optimize gluten networks. He was not thinking about microbiology. He was following steps that his master had taught him, that his master had learned from his master before that. He was doing what worked. What worked happened to be correct, down to the molecular level. He didn't know about gluten strands. He knew that when the dough felt right, smooth, elastic, pulling cleanly away from the board, the bread would rise. He knew it from his hands. How Manchet disappeared. Manchet did not get replaced by a better bread. Nothing better came along. 3 forces killed it. Each one came from a different direction. The first force was the mill. Through the 1700s, milling technology changed. Millstones gave way to roller mills, starting in the 1870s. Roller milling removed the bran and germ mechanically, efficiently, and cheaply. By 1880, roller-milled white flour was available to ordinary households across England for roughly the same price that coarse flour had cost a generation before. The technology that had made Manchet flour expensive, fine sieving by hand, was now unnecessary. Everyone could have white flour. When everyone can have what only kings could afford, it stops being special. And when it stops being special, nobody bothers to make it the hard way anymore. The second force was commercial baking. Through the 1800s, large commercial bakeries replaced household bakers in wealthy homes. The Aerated Bread Company, founded in London in 1862, began producing bread using mechanical processes. By 1900, the idea of a trained household baker producing made-to-order Manchet for a lord's table was an anachronism. The households that had supported Manchet bakers stopped employing them. The skill left the kitchen and had nowhere to go. The last great Manchet bakers did not retire gracefully. They were simply not replaced. When the head baker at a country house died or left, the household bought bread from a commercial supplier. Nobody trained a new head baker. The knowledge did not transfer, it just stopped. The third force was shame. By 1900, the English aristocracy did not want to look backward. They wanted modern conveniences. A kitchen that still made bread by hand the way Elizabethan households had was not a point of pride. It was an embarrassment. Cookbooks stopped including Manchet recipes. By 1920, you would be hard-pressed to find a professional baker in England who knew what Manchet was, let alone how to make it. The Oxford English Dictionary listed Manchet as an archaic word by 1933. Not forgotten. Archaic. The word was still in the dictionary, but only as a historical curiosity. The kind of thing you might find in an old play by Shakespeare, not in any kitchen. Today, Manchet appears in academic food history. It appears in the occasional historical reenactment, and it appears in two places you can actually experience it: Hampton Court Palace's Tudor kitchen demonstrations, where costumed interpreters occasionally bake manchet on open days, and Lacock Abbey in Wiltshire, which has tested period manchet recipes as part of its living history programme. A bread that fed English kings for 200 years lives now in two tourist attractions and a dictionary marked archaic. You can make it. You do not need a Tudor kitchen. You do not need a brick oven. You do not need silk bolting cloth. The manchet recipe from Thomas Dawson's The Good Huswife's Jewel, published in 1588, requires 5 ingredients: flour, water or milk, salt, yeast, and thyme. Here is how to make it. These are adapted steps based on Dawson's 1588 recipe and the reconstruction work done by food historian Peter Breers in his 2008 book Cooking and Dining in Medieval England. Step 1. Get the right flour. Use bread flour with a protein content of at least 12%. Do not use all-purpose flour for this. It is too weak. You want strong gluten. The closest modern equivalent to bolted manchet flour is unbleached white bread flour, sifted twice through a fine sieve to remove any remaining coarse particles. About 500 grams, roughly 4 cups. Step 2. Make a sponge. In a bowl, mix 100 grams of your flour with 150 milliliters of warm water and a teaspoon of active dry yeast. Cover it. Leave it for 2 hours. You will see it bubble and foam. This is your starter sponge. Medieval bakers would have used fresh ale balm here. This is the closest modern substitute. Step 3. Mix the dough. Add the sponge to the remaining 400 grams of flour. Add a teaspoon of fine salt and 100 milliliters of warm whole milk. Mix until a dough forms. The dough will be fairly stiff. Stiffer than sandwich bread dough? That is correct. Step 4. Knead for 20 minutes. Use the heel of your hand. Push, fold, turn, repeat. At the 10-minute mark, the dough will feel smooth and elastic. At 20 minutes, it will feel almost silky. If it starts to feel tough, cover it and rest it for 5 minutes, then continue. This is the step most modern recipes skip. Step 5. Shape and score. Divide the dough into 6 to 8 equal pieces, around 80 to 90 grams each. Shape each into a smooth ball, then flatten it slightly so it is about an inch thick. With a sharp knife, score a shallow ring around the outside of each loaf, about a ½ inch in from the edge, cutting about a ¼ inch deep. Medieval bakers did this to guide the rise. It still works. Step 6. Rest, then bake. Cover the shaped loaves with a cloth. Let them rest for 30 to 45 minutes until slightly puffed. Bake at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, 200 degrees Celsius for 20 to 25 minutes. The outside should be pale gold, not deep brown. The inside should reach 190 degrees Fahrenheit, 88 degrees Celsius on a probe thermometer. What you will see, the score ring opens slightly as the bread rises in the oven. The crust will be thin and crisp. Tap the bottom, it should sound hollow. Your first attempt will probably come out a little denser than ideal. That is normal. The kneading takes practice. Your hands need to learn what right feels like. Try it twice before you judge it. After 2 or 3 bakes, you will understand what a manchet is supposed to be. Soft, white, slightly rich from the milk. A thin crust that crackles. This is the bread that sat at the king's table. It is not complicated. It is not made from rare ingredients. It just requires time, the right technique, and the willingness to knead for 20 minutes when everything in modern life tells you to rush. For roughly 200 years, From the early 1500s through the late 1600s, Manchet was the pinnacle of English baking. Household accounts, cookbooks from 1545 through 1700, and royal kitchen records all document it. Then milling changed. Commercial baking grew. The households that employed skilled bakers stopped employing them, and Manchet became a word in old books. What disappeared was not the recipe. The recipe survived in Dawson's book, in Markham's The English Housewife of 1615, in a dozen others. What disappeared was the class of people, both those who ate it and those who made it, who gave Manchet its reason to exist. The knowledge is still there. 5 ingredients, 1 technique, 20 minutes of kneading. Nobody is stopping you. If you found this valuable, hit that like button and subscribe. We investigate forgotten knowledge that the modern world left behind, not because the old ways were always better, but because some of them were remarkably good and we forgot to ask why before they disappeared. Drop a comment below. Had you ever heard of Manchet before this video? And if you try making it, let us know what happens. We read every comment. We will see you in the next one.